Hi y'all, Raidwald here. This is my third video now in response to Lee Lemon's video discussing theist evidence, wherein she addresses logic. So take it away, Lee.
A third type of evidence people use is this logical argument, where they say X, therefore God.
Are you really going to attempt to brush off all logic and all logical arguments just in order to attack the conclusion that a God must exist? Look, I'm sorry, but X, therefore Y, can be extraordinarily valid. That is the basis of all human knowledge. So let's see what you actually bring to bear against this idea, without, of course, using any logic. So let's just see what you have to say here.
Now, some people are going to go ahead and try to post about the finely tuned argument, or the finely tuned universe argument. Please save your time, because you end up posting like several comments because of the character limit. Please save your time, because as soon as you try to post it, a bunch of atheists are going to jump in and just rip it apart. It's a ridiculous argument, and it's been debunked for many reasons. Please look it up.
Because assertions. Okay, so if you have one good argument that debunks the finely tuned universe argument, it would take you very little time to say it, to link it, or to otherwise point us in the direction where your debunking can be found.
Because remember, in order to end an argument effectively forever, all you have to do is provide one great sound counter-argument. That's all you need. It's just one. You don't need a shotgun of 50 mediocre ones. You need one good one. Now, I'm not a cosmologist or an astrophysicist. I'm not a scientist of any type in this field, and so I will leave the science of this debate to them. However, from my little bit of research into this argument, this debate, it seems apparent that both sides are perfectly happy to say that this universe is, in some way, fine-tuned for the environments that, to allow for the environments that allow for the development of life. And both sides of the argument are providing their conclusions as to, how this can be. If your side of the debate did not think that the universe was fine-tuned to allow for the existence of environments which allow for the existence of life, then they wouldn't be presenting any arguments as to why this is the case. But they do. That's a large portion of the debunking of using the finely tuned universe as an argument for the existence of God. So that seems like it's pretty well accepted on both sides. I have noticed several atheists that are not in the, who are also not in the field of astrophysics, physics or cosmology, who have entered into this debate and put forth the idea that that the universe isn't really fine-tuned for life because so much of the universe is devoid of life. That seems to be kind of a favorite one. But that's a straw man, because it's not addressing what is actually being stated. What is actually being stated, as far as I can tell, in the fine-tuned universe argument, is that the universe is fine-tuned to allow for the environments which would allow for a life. In other words, if there was a deviation in this so-called fine-tuning, then there would be no possibility for any of the environments which allow for life as we know it to exist. The fact that life is rare or sparse in the universe, if indeed it is, does not negate the fact that environments in which life can exist do exist. That is the argument being made. That is the argument you should address. So let's go on to one of the counter-arguments which does address that particular idea.
Most of the arguments against the finely tuned universe argument rely on explaining why we would see a universe that is finely tuned. And when you look at those, most of those fall into the category of arguments based on the idea of a multiverse. Now, I'm not an astrophysicist, I'm not a cosmologist, I'm really not even any kind of scientist. This is not my field of expertise, and so I'll leave the debates over the actual science to scientists, and I'll just look at the form of arguments that we are seeing. The multiverse has got to be the worst infraction of Occam's razor imaginable. It literally multiplies the entities infinitely in order to explain something we see in reality. It also is just as unfalsifiable as the assertion that there is a God. Bringing up a multiverse to explain the fine-tuning of this universe really doesn't do anything better than bringing up a God to explain the fine-tuning of this universe. The only thing it does, which the God hypothesis does not, is it avoids a God. That's literally the only thing it does better. And that's assuming you consider not using a God better, which I'm sure you will. But I've spent more than enough time on an argument that I don't necessarily even endorse myself, and which you didn't bother providing any counter-arguments to. So I'm going to leave it at that until such time as you bring forth actual arguments I can address or accept.
Don't just keep reiterating it. I recently had somebody in my comments section that wrote, dark matter, scientists have found dark matter. Dark matter is God, and it's the truth. It is Jesus. It proves that Jesus is real and died for our sins and all this other stuff. And I thought, what? How do you jump from that? How is dark matter existing somehow sentient? And if it is sentient, how is it a God? And if it is a God, how is it your God? How does it suddenly prove this? And instead of explaining how he reached that conclusion, he just kept reiterating, dark matter exists, it is God, it is my God. And of course that is ridiculous.
I'm not sure that really is ridiculous. You have to take the man at his word. If he says that dark matter is his God, be willing to accept that. And if you believe that dark matter exists, then guess what? His God exists. Or do you just not like the word God? Right? What if somebody said that their God is a specific tree that's growing in their backyard? Would you still tell them that God does not exist? What if they could send you a picture of that tree? Would you still tell them that their God does not exist? It may be ridiculous that they'd consider that tree their God, sure, but it's not ridiculous for them to claim that God exists if that tree is their God. In fact, it's your position that really becomes ridiculous at that point, because again, your issue is with the word God, not with what it defines or what it describes. What it defines or describes could very well exist, and you just brought up an example of one which has been scientifically proven to exist, and you will still fight against that word God. What does that say about you?
Now, some people are listening to this and you're thinking, yeah, but I have a more airtight, logical argument, you don't.
And this right here is indicative of the great arrogance and flaw in your thinking. This is truly ideological and dogmatic, as much so as any religious person out there that you would point at and laugh for their ideology and dogmatism. How can you possibly say that an argument is not airtight before you have heard the argument? How could you possibly make that claim? The assumptions underlying this are simply that God does not exist, therefore any arguments which prove God's existence are not airtight. Therefore, your arguments that God does exist are not airtight. It's circular reasoning in its most pure and simple form.
And the problem is, with a logical argument, it can be logically correct and factually wrong. For example, if I said, if I have a black shirt, then people with black shirts can fly. I have a black shirt, therefore I can fly.
This is not, in fact, logically correct. It really isn't. It's logically valid, but that's not the same as saying it's correct. Saying it's correct speaks to the truth value of the conclusion. The conclusion is clearly false. It is logically valid in that the conclusion it must be derived. Well, let's put it this way. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. That is the definition of a logically valid argument. The argument you presented was logically valid. However, it was not logically sound because one of the premises was demonstrably not true. If a theist provides a logically valid argument that is also sound, then it is true, and there's no escaping that. It's correct both in terms of logic and in terms of reality, however you want to try to define that. So, yeah, sorry, just deal with that. And frankly, if you're going to speak on logic, at least go through the trouble of learning enough about logic to be able to correctly use the definitions, use correct terms to define what you're describing, right? What you've done here is simply just demonstrate your own ignorance of the field at the same time that you're trying to strike it down.
That's logically sound. That is a completely logically sound argument, but it's factually wrong. There's no special power that a black shirt can imbue on a person to allow them to fly. We don't, that doesn't happen. So even though it's logically true, it's factually wrong. So hopefully you can understand that.
I can actually understand it better than you can. Or what you're trying to say anyway, better than you can. You see, again, you're misusing the words. Not only are you not using the right words, you are using the right words in the wrong way. Logically sound is not the same as logically valid. You said logically sound. What logically sound means is that an argument is valid, i.e., the conclusion is derived, must be derived, is necessarily derived from the premises. Right? A valid argument is one in which, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. A sound argument is a valid argument in which the premises are true, and therefore the conclusion is also true. When you referred to a valid argument as a sound argument, you misused the word. You have demonstrated nothing but your own ignorance of logic. And let's look at what you're trying to do with logic. Right? Let's look at the logic of what you are attempting to do. You're trying to say that some logically arrived at conclusions are not true. Therefore, all logic is bad. Therefore, all logic is not to be trusted. This is, again, not only is this an invalid argument, invalid logic, but it's also extraordinarily intellectually lazy. The correct approach to an argument like the one you provided is to attack the premise that is false, to demonstrate why that premise is false, and to therefore show that even though the logic is valid, the conclusion is not a sound one. That's the correct approach. The incorrect approach is to say, well, some valid arguments are not sound, and therefore all logic needs to be tossed out the window. I mean, you understand that logic is used in science too, right? That logic is basically at the heart of everything humans attempt to understand. If you try to strike down all of logic because you don't like the way in which it is sometimes instantiated, then you've thrown out millions of babies for a little bit of bathwater.
Again, I can try to use, you as my neighbor. I can say, well, my neighbor hates me, and he, only somebody that hates me would attack my car. Therefore, it was my neighbor.
Okay, that argument's not even logically valid anymore. It's a completely different type. Why? Because I can look at that. I can say, okay, all people who hate you, or rather, only people that hate you would damage your car. Your neighbor hates you. Therefore, your neighbor damaged your car? No, because somebody else might hate you too, right? The logic in that is invalid in that the conclusion does not derive necessarily, by necessity, from those premises. We could accept both those premises as true, and yet the conclusion could still be false. It is therefore an invalid argument.
Well, no, that doesn't prove it was your neighbor. It proves you think it was your neighbor, but it doesn't prove it was your neighbor.
I agree it doesn't prove it was your neighbor, but it also doesn't prove what you think it proves.
So anytime you're about to argue something that from a logical perspective, you have to ask yourself, are the premises factually true? And I've had people say, well, you just have to use this as a given. No, we don't. There is no reason to use this as a given. And ask yourself, would you accept your same argument with a different God? You wouldn't. Because the person that said dark matter exists, therefore it's God, therefore it's my God, he's not saying dark matter, he would never accept somebody saying dark matter exists and it's Allah. He would never accept that.
Did you ask him? If the guy's willing to accept that dark matter is Jesus, it actually would be a little bit easier to accept that dark matter was Allah, right? Because Jesus at least had the appearance of being a physical being at some point that lived on the earth. Now, he could do some sort of mental tap dances around that. Plenty of religions do. But, yeah, it'd be much easier to ascribe Allah, to believe that Allah was dark matter. And, honestly, there are plenty of theists, Christian and Muslim, that accept Allah and God as the same God, right? We worship the God of Abraham. That's why they're called Abrahamic religions. Now, they may have a different understanding of God's character, but you don't even have to leave Christianity to find half a dozen different characters of God. So, would people be willing to accept those same arguments? Well, possibly. And you know what? If a person argues, dark matter is my God, dark matter exists, therefore my God exists, then I would say, you're right. Dark matter exists. I accept the scientific evidence that it does, and if you say that dark matter is your God, well then okay. Now, I can't really speak for what other theists will or will not accept as argumentation, or as evidence in support of any conclusions. I can only speak for myself on that matter. And I would say, and I think this is quite a reasonable approach, that I would address each argument individually or not at all. I'm not going to toss out every single religious claim out there in the world simply on the basis that it might disagree with my own, simply on the basis that that person is not the same religion as me. For all I know, their religious experience actually confirms my religious beliefs. And if I don't bother to hear and evaluate it first, then I won't know that. And there's millions of different ways to approach each one of these arguments, right? There's some of the approaches that you yourself denied that you were using, but were actually using, right? I could always say, well, this person is clearly lying. He is benefiting from what he is saying tremendously, and it doesn't seem to square with my experience of the world, so I'm going to assume that he is willfully lying to people. Or I could say, you know what, this person seems genuine, he seems sincere, he seems honest, but it doesn't square with my experience of reality, and he can't provide what I consider to be compelling evidence. Therefore, I consider that this guy is hallucinating or insane or lost his grasp on reality, or rather, what is the difference between fantasy and reality. Or I could simply say, well, yeah, he experienced these things, but he misinterpreted them. Right? There's just as many approaches for me to take as there are for you to take. The difference is that I'm not going to try to jump to, well, everything all at once that disagrees with my position is wrong. That is again, I've said it a couple of times, but it's just intellectually lazy. What you need to do is A, either approach every single claim individually and judge it on its merits, or B, just not approach any of the claims. Don't say anything at all. But you're not doing that. You're saying something. You're trying to say something one time for every and all religious claims. Do you see the problem with that? What if we judged people in that way? What if we just said, well, a black man once stole my car, therefore, all black men are car thieves? Would you accept that kind of argumentation? Judge everything individually.
In the same way, many people would not accept any kind of argument from, Hindus if they're not Hindu, or Wiccans if they're not Wiccan.
Okay, name those people so that we can all ridicule them together. Right? Especially since you use the term any argument. Right? You weren't even talking about religious arguments. You were talking about any argument whatsoever. Somebody who's going to throw out an argument on, who the better basketball team is on the basis of the person giving the argument's religion is themselves an idiot.
And so that's the thing that you have to remember. You're not going to accept this either.
That's a pretty gross assumption on your part. Give me an example of an argument, and I'll address it individually. But you can't sit there and say that, assume to understand every single position I will hold on every single argument ever given by every single theist out there that disagrees with me.
And even just in daily life, outside of religion, like I used the example with the car, you're not going to accept that as evidence either. It has to be factually correct, not just make sense logically.
Okay, here's one of the problems I think we're having. If we're going to have an epistemological debate, you need to define your terms a little more clearly so that we can actually know precisely what you're meaning and what I'm meaning, and so there's no confusion between us. What do you mean by factually correct? Precisely. Because for any meaning you can come up for factually correct, I simply cannot find a way to verify whether something is factually correct without the use of logic. Right? If you really, and when we're talking about epistemology, you have to question all of your assumptions. All of them. That was the very point that René Descartes was trying to address when he came up with his famous thought experiment. Right? He started off with, okay, what would be the most questionable set of circumstances imaginable? What is the worst case scenario for knowledge? And what he came up with is a demon that had power to deceive him over everything. And he thought, okay, well, is there one thing this demon couldn't deceive me about? And his answer is quite famous. I think, therefore I am. Right? His conclusion to that was, this demon could never deceive me about my own existence. He couldn't tell me that I exist if I don't, or convincingly tell me that I don't exist when I do. Why? Because experiencing the deception in and of itself is proof of existence. So that's the level to which you need to question your own assumptions here. Now, starting from that position, right, we can actually accept Descartes' argument there. I'll accept that one because I find it absolutely convincing. So starting from that point, you exist. Prove the factual existence or occurrence of anything. Anything. And do so without logic.
Again, things can make logical sense and they're factually wrong. That was with the black shirt example in Flight.
Alright, so that's the end of her approach to logic. So I'm going to go ahead and end the video here, and I'll handle her final claim in another video. But just to sum this one up, Lee, you could literally attend day 1 of Logic 101 in your local community college, wherever that is, and walk away with a better understanding of logic than you are currently displaying. You are misusing basic terminology and miscategorizing arguments that are easy to categorize. So before you decide to take an entire methodology for human knowledge and stomp on it and spit on it and try to bury it, it would behoove you to at least become basically familiar with it. Just spend a little time researching it before you decide to write it all off at once. Anyway, thanks for watching. I appreciate all you guys' comments and thoughts below, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.